Sorry. Uh, yes, say that in many ways I would share your optimism, although in this country, in the United Kingdom, of course, and maybe because it's much more prevalent now to speak openly about Palestine, there are countermeasures taken by people from above and by local lobbies. So the Prevent program, which you are familiar with, I'm sure, is also targeting any events that deal with criticism on Israel. Recently, we have been exposed to a different kind of assault of freedom of speech when it comes to Israel and Palestine through the new definitions of the Holocaust denial, where criticism on Israel is equated with anti-Semitism, and denial of the Holocaust. Just recently, the Secretary of State for Higher Education considered withdrawing funding for universities if the definition of the International Holocaust Remember Alliance for Holocaust denial would not be endorsed, a definition that, as I mentioned before, really equates criticism on Israel with Holocaust denial. So maybe this is a measure of success, the fact that there are also still, at least in the UK, some assaults on this question. But if I may sort of take it to a different angle of this debate, because we are in a better position now to talk in the academia about Israel and Palestine, and probably, as you say, there's some influence on the media, but I'll come back to the media later on. There is a different angle to this question when we are struggling with policies such as Prevent in the UK, or the definitions of the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remember Alliance, that tries to stifle discussion on Palestine. Our students, in a recent debate on the IHRA issue, which we had in the Institute, raised concern that echoed concern that I know you had at the time on the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the BDS movement, and you raised it among other places in our joint book on Palestine. On the one hand, there is a wish to continue and struggle in this country, also I suppose in the United States, against any attempt to silence criticism of Israel that is done usually by weaponizing anti-Semitism as a principal tool of intimidation. On the other hand, there is a worry that freedom of speech, rather than the plight of the Palestinians, becomes the main focus of the solidarity movement. How can we balance both legitimate concern, indeed without forgetting the primary motivation for solidarity? Because quite a lot of people sort of feel that one stress comes at the expense of the other. And I know that this is some of the criticism that you had at the time, or worries rather, it was not criticism, I think it was more concern, where focus on freedom of speech rather than the topic that the freedom of speech is supposed to serve would kind of divert the attention from the real issues at hand.
Well, it's a constant. I think the increase in the intensity of efforts to silence discussion on this topic recently in the United Kingdom, I think that's a sign of the increased desperation of supporters of Israeli policy as they see the control of opinion slipping out of their hands. They're resorting to harsher and more desperate measures to try to block any discussion, any condemnation. So in a way, it's sort of a good sign to see the attempts to extremism of the attempts to silence discussion. Means situations getting out of their control. It used to be much easier in England. So just to remind you of event back in the 80s, which I'm sure you remember, late 80s, I think, or maybe 90s, don't remember exactly when. There's a journal, Index on Censorship, which is concerned with issues of freedom of expression and so on. It had been focused about 100% on Eastern Europe, on the attempts in Eastern Europe to silence dissidents and so on. The editor of the journal, who himself was an Eastern European dissident, decided that it would be interesting to try to shift it, to open the discussion to another area, actually an area that George Orwell wrote about, suppression of thought in free societies. I should mention that Orwell's essay on this was suppressed. It's the introduction to Animal Farm, which was suppressed, came out 30 years later. It was about how in free England, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. Now, theoretically, it's available. Well, the editor of Index wanted to do the same thing, open up Index on Censorship just for one article on how ideas are suppressed within free societies. So he invited me, and I wrote an article on how discussion of Israel-Palestine is suppressed in the United States without the use of force, just by other means. The roof fell in. He had to retire. The journal was closed. Huge attack on the journal for allowing this to happen. Turned out later that it was initiated by a leading exponent of freedom of speech and a person who was, in fact, an old friend, Isaiah Berlin. Behind the scenes was orchestrating this attack. Was denied, all sorts of things, but it became very clear. Well, the journal was reconstituted. I don't think it has gone in this dangerous direction, at least in the years that followed. That was then. You could just silence things. Now it's not so easy. It's harder, and therefore the effort to follow Abba Evan's advice from 50 years ago and to tar any criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, that's intensifying. The idea is picking up. You've seen a lot of it in England. I don't have to report it. But I think it's all a reflection of the fact that indeed Israeli policies are becoming increasingly difficult to defend. And it's necessary to resort to means of suppression of opinion, if possible, shifting the topic to anti-Semitism, to something else, in order to marginalize it. I should say that segments of the left very mistakenly are joining in on this, not on this issue, but on other things. What's called cancel culture is an effort by students, some others, to try to prevent the kind of talk that they don't want to hear. It's wrong in principle, and it's tactically idiotic. It's a gift to the right wing. They love it. And it, of course, what it means is those who have the power will use it for their interests. So yes, all these problems arise all the time. And what you have to do is keep your eyes on the main issues. The main problem is not academic freedom in Britain and the United States. It's the plight of the Palestinians. Anything that diverts attention to that, from that, and from what's going on and what we can do about it, anything that diverts attention from that is completely wrong. We have to focus on that and what can be done. And there is, in fact, a lot that can be done, including things that are not discussed, possibly because they're so important. When something is not discussed and is very topical, you should be concerned. So there is something that on the surface doesn't seem to be related to Israel-Palestine, but in fact is very closely related, and that's Iran. Right now, front pages, constant talk, great threat of Iranian nuclear weapons programs, supposed programs. Got to do something about it. Big negotiations in Vienna. Actually, there's something very simple to do about it, which everyone knows and thinks about these things, but nobody's allowed to talk about. And it has to do with Israel. A very simple way to solve the problem, alleged problem of Iranian nuclear weapons, is to institute a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. That would resolve the problems, reduce tensions, have enormous positive effects. Why isn't it done? Iran is strongly in favor of it. The Arab states have been strongly in favor of it for 30 years. There's the ones who instituted it, including Egypt. Global South overwhelmingly in support of it. No criticism from Europe. They'd go along with it. It's blocked because the United States vetoes it, most recently Obama, and the United States vetoes it because it does not want Israeli nuclear weapons to be open to inspection. In fact, the United States does not acknowledge their existence, though it's not in doubt. And the reason is that American law would come into play and raise the question whether any U.S. aid to Israel is even legal under U.S. law. Well, it's an important point that could be pushed by an activist group. Bring to the American population, similar things in England, the fact that we're facing serious threats of war, danger, in order to preserve the huge flow of military and economic aid to Israel and to Egypt, incidentally, to the Egyptian dictatorship, which is connected with this. These are things which have a lot of resonance among American population, could lead to raising very serious questions about the nature of U.S. support for Israel, and even a hint of withdrawing any of that support would have a big impact on Israel's policies. Israel is very dependent on the United States for support, has been ever since the 1970s, when Israel adopted a very clear policy of choosing expansion over security, meaning reliance on the United States for protection. It's a very fragile system. Well, these are things that could be done right away, could have a big effect. There are others that you can think of. So yes, there are possible actions within our reach, which would have a major effect on global politics, and in particular on Israel-Palestine rights. Necessary to think about them. They're not presented to you every day in the newspapers, obviously. You have to think them through and see what the interconnections are. And there are many.